You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kate White.
Thanks for tuning into Author Stories today. We've got a fantastic show coming up for you. As always, go to hankgarner.com where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere that you like to get your author interviews, you can find us there. I'd like to thank Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White today for sponsoring this episode with their book, The Fire Thief. She fights to survive, but only white-hot rage will reveal her true power. Remembering the hope of the past helps Stasha endure her bleak present. Blaming herself for her best friend's injury, she brawls and steals to provide in a world run by Fae. But with an arranged marriage approaching, Stasha swipes 2 silvers in hope of their escape and erupts into a fiery burst of magic. Surprised and confused by power she can't possibly control, Stasha barely has time to register that her friend has been sent off to die. With time running out and no options left, she must put her faith in powerful strangers as they dive into a Fae skirmish for supremacy. Surrounded by dubious allies, her only hope to redeem her past is to mount an attack on an inescapable death camp. As Stasha fights to free her friend, the battle she's faced her whole life is about to become a war. The Fire Thief is the first book in an exhilarating high fantasy series. If you like gutsy heroines, elemental magic, and epic sword and sorcery action, then you'll love New York Times bestselling authors Aaron St. Pierre and Gwen White's roller coaster tale. Buy The Fire Thief to unlock an ancient Fae destiny today. Also thanks to Patrice Fitzgerald and the Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. There are 5 volumes out, and a 6th one comes out this summer in the Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. Each release includes between 10 and 15 short stories, followed by a Q&A with the author. Some of the writers are New York Times and USA Today bestsellers. Some readers are saying it's a blisteringly good collection. These stories are full of great complex characters, not all of them human. Twists and turns and fantastic world building. Epic space battles, exotic aliens, far-flung planets. 15 fabulous tales that will thrill and surprise you, some chosen from previous Beyond the Stars volumes and some brand new, are in the Best Of collection. Come along as these award-winning authors sweep you along on adventures as broad as the universe and as deep as their imagination. The Beyond the Stars space opera anthology series. Pick it up today. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kate White on the show with me today. She has a phenomenal new book called Such a Perfect Wife, and I'll tell you what, it might be the summer read of the year. This book is tremendous. Welcome to the show, Kate.
Thank you, Hank. Great to be down there with you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. We begin each show with the same question, Kate, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Well, it's going to sound pretty boring, Hank, because I think a lot of women who are authors of suspense novels would say the same thing. It was after I read my first Nancy Drew book, Secret of Redgate Farm. I just love that book, and like a baby duck, I imprinted on Nancy. And at first, I thought I'm going to be a detective one day, but I was such a wuss. I then changed that to I want to write mysteries.
Love that. Well, it's not just women writers who are influenced by Nancy Drew. I'll tell you that.
Oh, all right. Confess to me. You're a Nancy Drew fan?
Well, I have an older sister who's about a year and a half older than me, and so I, by proxy, inherited everything that she read. And so, Nancy Drew were handed down to me, and then Agatha Christie, and then we started kind of building our shared loves. But yeah, that's Nancy Drew, Hardy Boys, those kind of circulated back and forth between us a lot.
Yeah, I graduated from Nancy a little later than I'd like to admit, probably like 15 or so. And then I didn't know where to go because it wasn't a time where there was an internet that could direct you. There was no Amazon to say, if you like this book, you might like this one. And when I was in college, Esquire magazine ran a big portfolio called Things Every Young Man Should Know. And there was a list of what they considered the 10 best murder mysteries ever written. And there was a Dashiell Hammett on there, and a Raymond Chandler, and a Ngaio Marsh, and an Agatha Christie, and a Nero Wolfe. And I just tore that out. I read all 10 of the ones they mentioned. And that was finally my graduation from Nancy Drew on.
That's so, we really take our technological world right now for granted. And I know it's been a slow evolution, but it's become such an ingrained part of who we are and the things we take in, and those Amazon recommendations. There was a time where you had to rely on someone else's actual recommendation, a librarian, a friend. Word of mouth used to be a real thing.
Oh, really? Sometimes I wonder, how did I ever research my books? Because it is so easy now. Even though I like to go in person to a location, sometimes I'm looking over my notes, I don't remember certain things. You can not only go online and find out everything you want practically about the site, but you can click onto videos too that will take you down streets. This is kind of off the subject, but my husband and I were moving in New York City, and we were just about ready to buy this one apartment, and I started to have second thoughts, even though it looked like they were going to accept our bid. And I went back to some of the other things the real estate agent has sent us and asked to see some other things again. And I said, yeah, and what about this apartment? And we got there. We loved it. We bought it, but we hadn't seen it before. So I said to my husband, he's really good with tech stuff, I said, hey, can you go back on my history and see how I discovered this apartment? And he said, Kate, you're not going to believe what you did. Instead of going to the actual building we'd looked at before, you went to Zillow, which is the big real estate site, and you clicked on, if you like that apartment, you might like this one. So it's exactly what you were talking about, Hank. That helped me buy my apartment, let alone helps me research my books and feel so much more capable of delivering information that's accurate, whether it's forensic stuff. Lately, I was researching something on a poison, and it was amazing what I could find out just online.
Right. Well, I think it's a great conversation to have, and yeah, we've gotten a little off the path of where this conversation might go, but I think this is an important thing for writers to think about, as well as readers, because we live in a time that's so data driven now, and we as readers can discover things that way, but we as writers, marketers, publishers, have access to data and the way people discover things. Do you think that has any effect on the way, maybe not the way we're writing books, but maybe the way we're marketing things, the way we're trying to get stories in front of readers? Does that data then affect the other side of the creative process, I guess I'm asking?
I think both. I was a big believer in data when I ran Cosmopolitan magazine. I went with my gut, but I did a lot of research. I'm data hungry. And I find that data is a really great tool, even for the imagination. I mentioned looking at a poison site. And as I was looking, I saw a tiny point being made about this particular poison that I realized could help a plot point in the book. On the flip side that you asked about marketing, yes, it's really so helpful these days, particularly for writers who are more aspiring authors who might be self-publishing, for writers who are just starting out and aren't getting big budgets in terms of PR, or even for mid-list authors. You now have the ability to market your own books on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook, and you can use the data you collect to help you. Like the person who helps me with my social media, she does a report every month for me on what the data is showing. And sometimes we switch gears based on the fact that, hey, this is a better way for me to be doing it. There's some interesting research that the international thriller writers did that basically said thriller writers readers for the most part are not on Twitter. They are discovering readers on Facebook and Instagram. So if you need to narrow down what you want to do in terms of social media because it's so demanding, that might be something you consider. Now, certainly there are big authors like Karen Slaughter and Paula Hawkins on Twitter, but it's not necessarily where you have to be if you're a mystery author. So I think data can be a really great tool for authors who don't get those big budgets.
Sure. But no matter what amount of data or any access that you have, if you don't tell a great story to begin with, all of that is kind of moot in the end.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There have been a couple breakthrough bestsellers that have started with a couple of fabulous reviews on Goodreads by real wonderful influencers, and then it takes off. But if the book wasn't great to begin with, it's not going to happen. Exactly
right. You mentioned a few minutes ago your time at Cosmopolitan magazine. Mm-hmm. What got you into the magazine business?
Well, when I was young, I knew I wanted to write. As I mentioned earlier, Hank, I loved Nancy Drew. And back then, I didn't know that you kind of have to pick a lane with your writing. So as a young girl, I wanted to write novels. I wanted to write poetry. I wanted to write for newspapers. I put out a little newspaper in my little hometown neighborhood. I wanted to write for magazines. I started my own little magazine in high school. And it was only when I got to college that I realized, no, you cannot be a writer in every single one of those areas. And I won a contest when I was in college called the Glamour Magazine Top 10 College Woman Contest. My school entered me, but I agreed to be a candidate because I thought this could be my ticket into magazines, and it was fabulous. I not only loved winning the contest, I was on the cover, and I met my husband 10 years later from one of the other winners introducing me to him. So it really paid off for me, and I loved being in the magazine business. I moved up. Over time, I ended up editing 5 magazines and Cosmopolitan for 14 years, which is the number one women's magazine brand in the world. And when I was there, we were the number one seller on newsstands in the U.S. and single copy sales. So it was exhilarating. But at one point, after I'd only been there a short time because I'd already been thinking about it, I decided to try my hand at writing a mystery because I thought I don't want to give up that other lane. And I'm a really big believer in reinvention and understanding we live long lives, so there's time to reinvent. Don't wait. Begin to make your plan and do it. And that's what I did. I wrote 8 mysteries while I was at Cosmo, always with the idea this would be my next act at a certain point in time.
Somebody out there needed to hear that. There's reinvention is such an important part of life. You know, the days of someone taking a career position, staying there for 50 years, getting the gold watch, those days are over, and for lots of reasons. One being that the world is just changing too fast around us. But that's such an important part that there's always time to pursue that dream, even if it's writing, a couple of pages a day. At the end of the day, to pursue that dream of writing a novel, it's always attainable.
Right. Hank, just what you said, it's changing so fast. And even though I was there in the golden years of magazines, 7 years ago when I was planning to leave, I had already seen that the magazine business was going off the rails. And I could tell that other people did not realize that. And I encouraged my staff to think beyond, to think about digital. And sure enough, the magazine business is just in really bad shape these days. And you have to keep your ear close to the ground and maybe have a couple of backup plans in your back pocket. And don't delude yourself. Things change quickly these days. But on the flip side of that is the excitement of doing something new and exciting and making a change. Change is scary, but it's really exciting when you get on the other side of it.
That first novel that you started working on at Cosmo, was that Even If It Kills Her?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, tell us about that story and about your journey to getting that book out there.
Well, it was something I so wanted to do. And when I had written a nonfiction book that was a big bestseller called Why Good Girls Don't Get Ahead. And I picked an agent, and she didn't know this, but I picked an agent to submit that idea to, who I knew had a big mystery writer in her in her stable. And
I love the ulterior motive.
Yes, ulterior motives are good, Hank, whether you're a mystery writer or not. And one day I said to her, hey, I'd really like to write a mystery. And she was kind of taken aback, and she said, Kate, you have such a great thing going with the nonfiction. But that was a Friday. On a Monday, she called me and said, look, I'm sorry if I didn't respond with all the enthusiasm. I think you should actually go for it. So I sat down and I started. I had an idea. And what I did was I made the main character, Bailey Weggins, a reporter at a magazine, because I figured that way I didn't have to do a ton of research about the protagonist, because I was right in that world. And the one thing that really helped me, and I hope people listening might find this helpful too, I had a procrastination problem. I had tried to write fiction back in my 20s, and I would just get derailed cleaning out my wallet on a Saturday morning, or depilling some sweaters or something like that. So I went back to a great tip a time management expert had told me. And he said that so often when we have a goal in life and we don't do it, it's because we've made it too big and unappealing. And he said it's kind of like a hunk of salami, and the only way to make it doable is to thin slice it, just like you would salami. So I started, while I was at Cosmo, I started that first book writing only 15 minutes a day, because I figured 15 minutes was a thin enough slice for me to tackle. And boy, that really worked. And then eventually I could get up to 30 minutes. And even when it was only 15 minutes, once I got in the groove, I would stay longer. So I would offer that advice to anyone who's been toying with the idea of writing or some other project, because they are a new phase in your life is daunting. And then I wrote it, and Kelly Ripa picked it as the first book in her book club. So it became kind of an instant New York Times bestseller, and that was 13 suspense novels ago. Wow.
The character of Bailey Weggins is such a phenomenal character. I love detectives that are not necessarily detectives, kind of people that are ordinary people that we might bump into in real life, that find themselves in extraordinary circumstances, and I think that's what I love about Bailey. You mentioned her a minute ago, but did you start to realize that she was going to be such an integral part of your writing career?
Well, when I got the first contract for the first book, they bought it as a 2-book deal, because they said they want this as a series. They wanted the character to come back. And I'd always loved the idea of writing about somebody who, Bailey's a true crime reporter. So she's at crime scenes, she's covering crimes, but she's at a disadvantage because she doesn't have the inside information the police have. So she has to work things from a different angle, and that was interesting to write about. She could she had to rely on her instincts and turning information around and looking at it from a different perspective. And the interesting thing is that while I was at Cosmo, even though writing mysteries seemed very different from my day job, Hank, yeah, I'm the woman who used to write those cover lines like mattress moves so hot his thighs will go up in flames. So writing murder mysteries was a whole different ball of wax. But I began to discover the Cosmo reader, like so many women in America, was really fascinated with shows like CSI and anything that dealt with Law and Order, those kinds of shows. And so I started doing true crime in the magazine, and I had an editor who oversaw that for me. And the funny thing is I realized I almost created a Bailey Weggins in my workplace.
That's so funny, so funny. One thing that I picked up from your writing, and I can definitely feel the Nancy Drew connection in that you structure your novels in such a way that I never want to stop reading. When you get to the end of a chapter, I have to know what's going to happen next. I think a lot of writers find it easy to come up with a great premise and to open a novel. There's lots of great beginnings of novels sitting on people's hard drives, I would imagine. And I think a lot of people come up with pretty good hooks for the end of a book and can think of a good way to land a book and think, oh, I can really trick the reader here or give them a real aha moment here. But that middle of the book, that mushy middle we talk about, is so hard to keep the story alive and engaging. So what do you do as a writer to ensure that the reader keeps turning pages and keeps engaged with the characters and wanting to know what's going to happen next?
Well, thanks so much for saying that. And actually, I just got a great email from my editor today because I handed in my new standalone. That's the crazy thing about having to do a book a year. You've got one out and you're trying to do PR for it, but you had to hand in the other book. But she wrote me such a nice email, and she said, it was a true pleasure to read the new book. You have a gift for keeping the reader turning the pages. And I do feel that I'm not a perfect writer, but I feel that's one of my strengths, that I do good cliffhanger chapter endings. And to be honest, I learned some of that from Nancy Drew. When I started out writing my first mystery, just for the heck of it, I went back and looked at some old Nancy Drew books. I went to the library and found some, and they had just reissued some with the original covers. And I realized every chapter ended with you wanting to go on. And I think one trick is to definitely plot the book out. I know that in the world of mystery writing, there are two types of writers, they say, plotters, and the others are pantsers. They go by the seat of their pants, and Lee Child tells me that's what he does, and God, he's fabulous. But I never wanted to be a pantser, mainly because I didn't want to have that name connected with me. Pantser.
It's a pretty awful name, isn't it?
But I find that if you are plotting, it makes it easier if you've set up your whole plot. And certainly when I'm writing, there are lots of twists that come to me that I haven't necessarily put in the plot. I don't write a very detailed plot outline. But, I know who the killer is. I know why they killed. I know how I'm going to disguise that person a bit. But I find with the plotting, it helps you not have the mushy middle so much, because you've got an idea where you're going, where the arc is, where those different plot pillars are, as they say in screenwriting. I also think when you're doing a chapter, it's really good to know in advance before you start where that chapter's going to end. Just don't find yourself getting to the end. I always think about how am I going to end this so the reader goes to the next chapter. And you're always looking for plenty of action in every scene. Joe Finder is a friend of mine. His book Judgment is so good. It just came out. And Joe told me once he has a little Post-it above his computer with the words, 3 words on it. And he knows that every scene should have one of these, at least one. Surprise, reveal or reversal. And in a sense, you want that happening totally, with the chapter, particularly at the end. So you have to be kind of calculated about it, Hank. You can't just let it happen with the magic of writing.
I agree with you there. If you need to know where the story's going for sure, and people do that with different levels of knowing what the story is. But Joseph Fender was on the show in episode 552. What an amazing writer, and what a great piece of advice. I think he talked about that on the show, knowing that each chapter needs to have a purpose.
Yes. You can't just be using it to get the character from this spot to that spot. There's got to be something big happening there. And that seems so simplistic, Hank, but when you're writing and you've got the whole morning stretching ahead of you, sometimes you find yourself just moving characters down the road because you've got pages to write, and it's really important to step back and say, did something stunning happen here? Because if it didn't, babe, you better go back and rework some of this.
Right. Well, the temptation is that if you keep doing that, your book just turns into a travelogue, and we're just moving characters around. And we've read Lord of the Rings before. We don't need another adventure travelogue.
Exactly.
Yeah. The pantser crowd, some of the more vocal pantsers, might meet your argument by saying, well, if you plan everything out to begin with, there's no excitement left in the book. Your characters become dull, and the writer is not as invested because she already knows where the story's going. What would you say to that?
Well, that's why I think you do a very loose outline. Laura Lippman once said at an event where I interviewed her, she's such a great writer, and she said that she thinks of her outline as just having a sense, if she's in a boat, of knowing what the distant shore is that she's going to land at. And then you let the magic of writing take over so that you may make discoveries as a writer as you're going through. I remember one of the weirdest discoveries for me was there was a guy in one of my books where all of a sudden I realized, oh my God, he's going to die. I had not planned that. And I felt so, I don't want him to die. But I just suddenly realized he's got to die. And so if you will just have a loose outline where who you know who the killer is, you know why the person killed, you know roughly how you are going to disguise that person. Then what I do is I use a notebook and I just more succinctly plot 4 chapters at a time, using a grid in the notebook. And then that allows for a lot more spontaneity than really doing one of those crazy outlines that I know some people do. But for me, I wouldn't enjoy it. Just what you said. I want the excitement of discovery when I'm writing too.
Well, I write kind of like that. I know where the story's going. I know who the antagonist is. I know motivations and things like that. So I like to think of it as I have a road trip planned out. I know the destination. I know where we're going. I know the big stops along the way. But that the detail planning, like you said, is about 3 or 4 chapters at a time. And it's kind of like driving. We know where we're ultimately going, but this is the headlights just ahead of us that we're planning, and we're seeing where we're going.
And you know what, Hank? That leaves room for you to pull over to that weird-looking diner.
Right.
Have a burger. You aren't expecting to stop at that place, but
right. And meeting crazy characters along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I love it. Well, let's talk about the new book, Such a Perfect Wife. This is also a Bailey Weggins mystery. What number is this in the series?
It's number 8, but it really works as a standalone. If you haven't read the others, you don't need to. I know a couple of people have actually written on my Facebook page telling other women, oh, don't go back and start if you don't want to. You can just start in on this one, and it's true. And in this book, Bailey is under assignment for a website called Crime Beat because she's discovered that the magazine business has gone to hell too. And she's writing true crime books, but she misses the excitement of doing a story in real time. So when Crime Beat approaches her and says, hey, if we have the right story at a certain point in time, do you want to do it? She says yes. So the book opens with her getting the assignment to go up to Lake George, New York, where a young wife and mother has disappeared while jogging, which is a headline we're so familiar with these days, the wife disappearing. And even as I was writing the story, I'd named the character who disappears Shannon Blaine. And then there was that horrible story about Chris Watts saying his wife Shannon had disappeared, but he'd really murdered her and the kids. So it's a familiar headline. And it's so often in these cases, the husband is the main suspect and he's guilty. But I wanted to play with the idea of what if there were other suspects and what if maybe the husband didn't do it? So that's what Bailey goes up to sort of see what's going on and trying to assess things and report on it for Crime Beat.
One of the most fun things to do as a writer is to write about writers. And maybe that's one thing that I love about the character of Bailey so much. It's not a big stretch to jump into her mind as a writer. She's obviously had a different career path than you. But what does that do for you creatively to get to write about someone who sees the world in a lot the same way that you do? And is that a fun thing for you to write about a writer?
It is. And I think for me particularly fun was that all the years I had this great corporate job, and Hank, I had a freaking clothing allowance in my job. Yes. I had access to the Cosmo Beauty Closet, and there were just so many wonderful perks with that job. But part of me always was a freelancer in my soul. And so Bailey in some ways was this alter ego of mine who didn't have to report to the man, who was her own person. And I love that part of her as a writer. And I think in some ways I gave her a strength of mine as a writer and a weakness. And just writing about them helped me kind of come to terms with them. The weakness is that sometimes feel squeamish about interviewing people who are connected on either deeply to a crime or on the periphery, because she hates getting in their faces when they're suffering or they're really don't want to talk to the press. And that's something that I had trouble with as a writer. Sometimes with interviews, I just feel like I'd so much rather be writing than interviewing. But I always felt one of my strengths, and this is certainly one for Bailey, is that she sees things sometimes from an interesting angle. And she always writes on her computer, of course, on her laptop, but she keeps an old composition book where she jots notes in it. And it's sometimes in rereading those notes that she sees something that maybe she missed the first time, but if she looks at it from a different way, she begins to see, okay, something's going on here. And in Such a Perfect Wife, there are some grisly moments as they begin to realize there may be a serial killer at large, and some bad stuff happens for Bailey, but ultimately she's able to understand the truth because of some of the things she's jotted down in that notebook and look back at and begins to see it from a different angle.
You said that the crime as it unfolds is on the surface is very familiar to a lot of us now. We've seen these headlines before, and they a lot of times they tend to unfold in a very similar way. And so as readers, when we approach a story like this, we come in with our own expectations and our own prejudices and our own expectations that the story is going to go a certain way. How do you start challenging the reader, knowing that we're all kind of desensitized to a lot of this stuff in certain ways, to keep us on our toes?
I actually feel today the reader expects to be surprised. And a bigger challenge is to surprise them in a way that they're going to find fresh, but not over the top ridiculous. I've read a couple of books lately that are by authors who have written other suspense novels that are just so far-fetched. I just can't believe it. It's just like, wait, what? I just finished one last night. I won't say who wrote it, but I think the pressure's on to, just pull a lot of crazy stuff out to make it interesting. It's a little bit like what happened with snack food. First of all, there were good old Oreos, and then it was Oreos with double the cream, and then it was Oreos with chocolate cream, and it's just gotten so crazy. And I think it's got the same way with these books. So the big goal for me is knowing that the reader wants to be surprised and doesn't have clear expectations, but to surprise them in a way that seems authentic and credible. So they're not going to go, oh, come on.
Right. Being careful not to overplay your hand as a writer, but in always trying to look for the next gotcha.
Exactly. I read a fabulous novel the other day by Lisa Jewell, and then she was gone. And even she says in the acknowledgments, boy, this book was bizarre. And my editor was really helpful for me to help me in terms of helping me figure out a way to rein it in enough and shape it enough. It is bizarre, but there's something so believable about it. And it's a gift when somebody can do that. She's such a great writer. I really love discovering her. And somehow they manage, the really good ones manage to do it in a way that you don't think they jumped the shark. You know that old expression with TV?
Exactly.
They jumped the shark.
Yeah, and I'm old enough to remember Happy Days when they actually jumped the shark.
Right, that expression came from.
Exactly.
There's just certain things. My husband and I were watching Killing Eve the other night. We went, did they just jump the shark with this episode? Got to be careful. For listening who doesn't know, there was, I guess, that scene in Happy Days where the Fonz jumped over a shark when he was water skiing. Was that
water skiing with his leather jacket on?
Yeah,
as you do, right?
And
yeah.
The show stopped making sense. They put, you have to keep pushing it, but they pushed it to the absurd, and
right.
You want to be careful not to jump the shark.
What you don't want your characters to become caricatures of themselves.
Right.
Yeah. You mentioned a little while ago that you had turned in your latest standalone novel. How do you, or is there a difference in the way you approach one of your standalone novels with one of your novels in the series?
Yes, and I actually just articulated this when I was talking to somebody lately. I think because of Bailey as a true crime reporter, she's always on the outside looking in. And she's not in the thick of it in the same way as the characters in the standalone where everything's happening to them. So she may be going through certain emotions that I'm sure certain true crime reporters go through, where she's horrified by what's happening. She might be scared when she's going someplace where she suddenly realizes maybe I shouldn't have gone into this house or gone into these woods. And yet the real crime is not happening to her, or the real shitstorm, I guess I should say. And for characters that I write about in the standalone, the stuff is happening to them, that somehow someone in their life has been murdered, someone their close proximity has been murdered. They are in real danger themselves because they're in the thick of it, not because they're on the periphery as Bailey is. So it's a different experience, and it's been interesting to do it both ways.
Excellent. Well, the new book is out everywhere now. It's available in Kindle and trade paperback, which we were talking about earlier. This is kind of the perfect format for books, I think. Audiobook, which we also love. Such a perfect wife. Kate, if people are just discovering you and want to find out more about what you do and follow along with what's coming up next, is there a place they can connect with you online?
Yes, thanks so much, Hank. They can go to my website, katewhite.com, which has a lot of information about all the books I've written. And a great place, I'm on Instagram, but I'm also on Facebook. I'm on every day, Kate White Author. And I love to connect with fans there. It's just been a great way to do it.
Excellent. We'll put links to all of it in the show notes. Kate, I love the book. I love what you're doing. I'm a big fan. Please come back again and let's talk writing some more.
Okay, Hank, with the next book's coming out next April, so please, can we just lock that down?
Absolutely. We'll go ahead and pencil that in now. We'll put it in ink.
Okay. Thanks,
Kate.
What you do for authors. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
Hello, young one. What ghoulish tale of horror shall we explore tonight? Shall we watch The Creepshow? The Nightmare on Elm Street? Child of the night, give me your answer.
Which one would Mom kill us for watching? Said Buddy. Dad grinned and his eyes grew wide.
Which do you think, Child of the Jackal?
The Omen!
And we might have time for Omen too, if we hurry. She'll be home by 11.
I'll be back. Buddy ran to his room. He stripped down to his Yoda underwear and fished in the closet. 2 minutes later, he snuck back into the living room wearing his skeleton costume from last Halloween. He crept up behind his dad, who was cueing the movie. But David Rittermeyer was too clever for that. He spun around at the last moment and bared fanged teeth torn from paper plates, drawing a yip of surprise and a cry of, "No fair!" Daddy kicked off his Reeboks, plopped his smelly gym socks on the coffee table, another thing that Mom would hate, and killed the lights. The scary intro music began. The screen showed the silhouette of a boy, about Buddy's age. His shadow was a long, creepy cross. The Antichrist, the son of the devil. Born of a jackal on a night of astrological portent, destined to bring about the end times and the final battle of good versus evil. Buddy sipped Sunkist and scooted up next to his dad. As the movie got scarier, he slipped an arm through his father's and cupped his big bicep. Buddy could feel his father's pulse. Dads get scared too. They flinched together, shouted together, pointed at the screen and covered their faces together. Buddy pressed his eyes to Daddy's shoulder just before the on-screen maid shouted, "It's all for you, Damien!" and dove from the roof, hanging herself. Buddy knew which parts he was old enough to watch and which parts he wasn't. He trusted his dad to let him know when to look again. Occasionally, his dad tricked him into peeking too soon, but that was part of the fun. They kicked their feet at the screen and shouted, "Look up! Look up! Oh, idiot! Don't get yourself killed!" At the climax, the hero of the movie, Mr. Thorne, discovered a birthmark of 3 6s on his son's head and dragged the little Antichrist to the altar of the church, determined to spear his son with holy daggers and end evil forever. After it was over, the Rittermeyer men sat silently through the credits. David put an arm around his son and ran his fingers through Buddy's hair. He wasn't searching for devil marks. He knew there weren't any. And Buddy was certain there were no daggers in his father's hand either. Those things were just make-believe. Real fathers and sons don't do bad things to each other. They were queuing up Omen 2 when the power went out. "No," Buddy whined. "Not on movie night." Daddy went to the window. "It's the whole block. Sorry, Damien. How about, scary blackout. Go get the Ouija board out of the guest room closet. Cool. And candles. Buddy found the Ouija board, hidden under old clothes. When he shut the sliding door again, the sight of a monster startled him, and he let out an involuntary, "huh!" sound. It was his own skeleton-bodied reflection in the mirrored closet door. He stared at it. He liked the effect of moonlight on his cheeks. Spectral, haunted, his eyes big and white. He clacked his teeth at himself, picturing his own grinning skull under his child's flesh, and gave an evil laugh. He was answered by a scream. A woman's scream. High-pitched and far away. One of the neighbors? Buddy dropped the Ouija board into a patch of moonlight and sat with it. "What's going on?" he whispered, his fingers on the heart-shaped wood planchette.